I was sitting in my new cardiologist's office for a routine checkup when a framed photograph on his mahogany desk made the blood freeze in my veins. It was my wife. She was wearing the custom red silk dress I had bought her in Milan just 3 months ago. When the doctor confidently walked into the room, I pointed at the frame and casually asked who the beautiful woman was. His face lit up with absolute adoration as he told me it was his fiancée, Cindy, who was unfortunately trapped in a miserable marriage with a dying billionaire. He smiled and said they were just waiting for his heart to finally give out. My own heart did not stop in that moment. Instead, it turned to ice. Before I tell you how I dismantled their perfect little murder plot, please let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you believe that betrayal should always be met with absolute calculated justice. I am Victor Harrison. I am 70 years old, and I have spent the last 4 decades building a logistics and commercial real estate empire right here in Chicago. I did not inherit a single dime. I built an $80 million fortune through sheer willpower, sleepless nights, and an instinct for reading people that has never failed me. At my age, you learn to see the world exactly as it is, stripped of all its pretty illusions. You learn to recognize the hungry look in a competitor's eyes. You learn to spot a bad deal from a mile away. But the one place a man never expects to be negotiating for his life is inside his own home. Or in this case, inside the pristine, sterile office of a highly recommended medical professional. My wife, Cynthia, had booked this appointment for me. Cynthia is 52, elegantly beautiful, and has been my second wife for the past 20 years. Recently, I had been experiencing some mild arrhythmias, nothing overly serious for a man of my age who has carried the stress of a massive corporation, but enough to warrant attention. Cynthia had been incredibly insistent. She researched the best specialists in the city, fretting over my health with a devotion that warmed my aging heart. She found Dr. Miles Preston. He was 48, flashy, and carried a reputation as a miracle worker for Chicago's elite. My executive assistant booked the appointment under my initials V. Harrison, a standard security protocol to avoid unnecessary press or preferential bias. The office was exactly what you would expect from a high society doctor. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the magnificent mile, sleek leather chairs, and a massive mahogany desk free of any medical clutter. I was sitting in one of those leather chairs waiting for the doctor to review my chart, when my eyes drifted to a silver picture frame angled slightly toward the doctor's chair. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. I leaned forward, squinting slightly. The woman in the photograph was laughing, her head thrown back in a moment of pure, unadulterated joy. Her blonde hair cascaded perfectly over her bare shoulders. But it was the dress that locked my lungs. It was a brilliant, fiery red silk dress with a distinct asymmetrical neckline. You do not forget a dress like that. You especially do not forget it when you personally paid a master tailor in Milan $15,000 to custom fit it to your wife's exact measurements just 3 short months ago. I remembered zipping her into that exact dress in our hotel suite, kissing her neck, and telling her she was the most beautiful woman in Italy. Yet here she was, immortalized in silver, sitting proudly on the desk of a man I had never met. My mind raced, attempting to process the cognitive dissonance. Was it a coincidence, a stock photo numb? The small scar above her left collarbone, a remnant from a childhood accident she had told me about on our 3rd date, was clearly visible. It was Cynthia. Before the shock could morph into a physical reaction, the heavy oak door swung open. Dr. Miles Preston walked in. He wore a tailored suit under his pristine white lab coat, exuding the kind of arrogant confidence that only comes from a life of unchecked privilege. He extended a manicured hand, flashing a brilliant, expensive smile. "Mr. Harrison, so glad to finally meet you. I apologize for the wait. I was just reviewing your preliminary EKG results." I shook his hand. His grip was firm, but my focus was entirely on my own internal thermostat. In the business world, when you discover a competitor's fatal flaw, you do not gasp. You do not flip the table. You smile and you let them keep talking. "Not a problem at all, doctor. I replied, keeping my voice smooth and perfectly measured. I gestured casually toward the silver frame on his desk. I was just admiring the photograph. That is a beautiful woman. Your fiancée. Dr. Miles chuckled a soft, affectionate sound that sent a fresh wave of cold fury through my veins. He walked behind his desk, glancing down at the photo with a look of absolute devotion. She is, actually, he said, his voice softening. Her name is Cindy, the absolute love of my life. Cindy. Cynthia. She had not even bothered to stray far from her real name. Congratulations, I said, leaning back comfortably in my chair, playing the role of a harmless, friendly older gentleman making small talk. You must be very happy. When is the big day? Miles sighed, adjusting his stethoscope around his neck. A shadow of frustration crossed his perfectly tanned face. Well, that is a bit complicated at the moment. We are waiting. Cindy is currently trapped in a rather nightmare of a marriage. Oh. I raised a brow, feigning mild, polite curiosity. That is a shame. Why doesn't she just leave? Miles leaned against his desk, crossing his arms. He seemed eager to brag, eager to share the tragic romance of his life with a stranger who he thought was just another anonymous patient. Her husband is a tyrannical, ancient billionaire, very controlling, very possessive. He would drag her through court for years and leave her with nothing if she tried to divorce him. But between you and me, he leaned in slightly, lowering his voice in a conspiratorial tone. His heart is failing. He doesn't have much time left. We are just waiting it out. Once nature takes its course, she will finally be free. The room seemed to shrink. The silence stretched for a fraction of a second, but in my mind, it lasted an eternity. A tyrannical ancient billionaire, a failing heart. They were just waiting it out. He did not know who I was. Cynthia must have used the alias Cindy Thorne, her maiden name, and kept my identity completely hidden from him. To Dr. Miles Preston. I was just V. Harrison, an older man with some minor cardiac complaints. He was entirely unaware that the ancient billionaire he was waiting to die was sitting less than 3 feet away, staring right into his eyes. Well, I said softly, my tone completely devoid of the violence building in my chest. I suppose patience is a virtue. I hope things work out exactly as they are meant to for you and Cindy. Thank you, Mr. Harrison. I appreciate that. He smiled, oblivious to the predator sitting across from him. He then picked up a sleek pen and turned his attention to my medical file. Now let us talk about you. Your EKG shows some mild irregularities. Nothing we cannot manage, but given your age, we need to be proactive. He opened a drawer and pulled out a small amber prescription bottle, sliding it across the polished wood toward me. I am prescribing a new medication for you. Miles continued, his tone shifting back to professional medical authority. It is highly effective for regulating arrhythmias like yours. I want you to take 1 pill every morning. It should stabilize your heart rate and prevent any sudden stress on your cardiovascular system. I picked up the amber bottle. It felt heavy in my hand. I looked at the neatly typed label with my name on it. Then I looked back at the photograph of my wife in the red Milanese dress. This was not just a prescription. This was the murder weapon. Cynthia had not just found me a doctor to manage my health. She had found a doctor who was highly motivated to see my heart stop beating. She had secured an accomplice who could prescribe a fatal cocktail under the guise of legitimate medical care, a man who could sign my death certificate without raising a single red flag. Take 1 every morning, I repeated slowly, gripping the bottle. Exactly. Miles nodded reassuringly. You might feel a bit fatigued the first few days as your body adjusts, but trust me, it is exactly what you need. I trust you completely, Doctor, I said, standing up. I slipped the bottle into the inside pocket of my tailored suit jacket. I will follow your instructions to the letter. Excellent. We will schedule a follow-up in a month to see how you are progressing. I look forward to it, I replied. I turned and walked out of the office, my posture perfectly straight, my pace steady. I did not run. I did not confront him. I stepped into the private elevator and pressed the button for the lobby. As the steel doors closed, sealing me in the quiet descent, the civilized, loving husband I had been for 20 years quietly died. In his place stood the man who had ruthlessly conquered the Chicago real estate market. My enemies were no longer in boardrooms. They were in my bed, and they were holding my prescription pad. They thought they were dealing with a clueless, dying old man. They had absolutely no idea the kind of war they had just started. The ride back to my penthouse overlooking Lake Michigan gave me 30 minutes to cage the fury burning inside my chest. I had spent my entire life evaluating risks, neutralizing threats, and acquiring assets. My home was supposed to be my sanctuary. Instead, I was walking back into a viper's nest. When the private elevator doors opened directly into our foyer, the scent of expensive lilies and Cynthia's signature perfume greeted me. She was standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows in the living room arranging a bouquet. She wore a pristine white blouse and cashmere trousers, the very picture of a devoted, elegant wife. I walked toward her, leaning slightly on my cane to maintain the illusion of the fragile old man she and her doctor so desperately wanted me to be. "Victor, darling," she cooed, walking over to kiss my cheek. Her lips felt like ice against my skin. "How was the appointment with Dr. Preston? I have been worried sick all morning." I offered a tired, appreciative smile, gently patting her hand. "He was excellent, Cynthia. Very thorough. He said my heart needs careful management, but he prescribed a new medication that should fix these little episodes." I reached into my jacket pocket, pulled out the amber bottle, and placed it on the marble kitchen island. "He seems very confident in this treatment." Cynthia's eyes darted to the bottle. It was a microscopic movement, a barely perceptible flicker of triumph, but I saw it. I had spent 40 years reading the micro-expressions of ruthless executives across negotiation tables. That look was greed. Pure, unadulterated greed. "Oh, thank goodness," she sighed, placing a comforting hand on my chest, right over the heart chart she was plotting to stop. "I just want you to be healthy and around for a very long time." I looked at her, truly looked at her, and decided to test the waters. "You know, seeing the doctor today reminded me of our trip to Milan. We walked so much that day. Do you remember that custom red silk dress I bought you, the one with the asymmetrical neckline? I have not seen you wear it in months. You should put it on for dinner tonight to celebrate my good health." Cynthia did not miss a single beat. Her heart rate did not elevate. Her breathing remained steady. She just smiled, a gentle, almost apologetic curve of her lips. "Oh, darling, I donated it to the charity auction last month," she said smoothly, pouring me a glass of sparkling water. "Do you not remember? It was just a bit too flashy for my taste these days. Besides, the auction raised so much money for the children's hospital. I thought you would be proud." It was a masterful lie. Flawless. Plausible. Delivered with the perfect amount of altruistic charm to make me feel guilty for even asking. If I had not seen that exact dress draped over her shoulders in a silver frame on her lover's desk just an hour ago, I would have believed her. I took the glass of water from her hand, marveling at the monster I had married. "Of course," I replied, taking a slow sip. "You always were so generous." "Always," she whispered, handing me the amber bottle. "Now, did the doctor say you should take this immediately? We should not delay your treatment." "He said 1 pill every morning," I answered, "but he suggested I start right away." I opened the bottle. Inside were small, unassuming white capsules. I knew I had to take the first one. If I hesitated, if I refused, her suspicion would ignite, and a cornered rat is far more dangerous than a comfortable one. I needed her to believe she was winning. I placed the pill on my tongue, raised the glass, and swallowed it right in front of her. Her smile widened, her eyes crinkling with what looked like genuine relief. She kissed my cheek again. "Perfect. You go rest in the study, darling. I will have the chef prepare a light, heart-healthy lunch for you." I nodded and walked slowly toward my private study. As soon as the heavy oak doors clicked shut behind me, the facade dropped. I sat heavily in my leather chair, staring at the Chicago skyline. I needed to formulate a plan. I needed to isolate my assets, contact my legal team, and prepare a counteroffensive that would leave them both in ruins. But before I could even open my secure laptop, the physical toll of that single white capsule hit me like a freight train. It started as a dull, localized ache directly behind my sternum. Within 20 minutes, that ache blossomed into a sharp, suffocating pressure. I gripped the armrests of my chair, my knuckles turning white. The room began to spin, the edges of my vision blurring into a hazy, disorienting gray. A cold sweat broke out across my forehead, soaking my collar. This was not a placebo. This was not a minor adverse reaction. The doctor had given me a weapon disguised as medicine, a chemical cocktail designed to push an already stressed cardiovascular system straight off a cliff. My left arm went entirely numb, a terrifying heavy deadness that radiated from my shoulder down to my fingertips. My breathing became shallow and rapid. Every inhale felt like drawing broken glass into my lungs. I tried to stand to reach the hidden intercom under my desk that connected directly to my private security team, but my legs buckled. I collapsed back into the chair, clutching my chest. Panic, cold and primal, clawed at my throat. Was this it? Was I going to die right here in my study, surrounded by my wealth, murdered by a single pill on the very first day? I forced myself to breathe. In and out. Slow and measured. I refused to let Cynthia win this easily. I refused to give Dr. Miles Preston the satisfaction of signing my death certificate today. I dragged myself toward the lower drawer of my desk, my fingers fumbling with the biometric lock. Inside was a hidden compartment containing emergency medical supplies, including a potent vasodilator my previous actual doctor had given me for severe angina attacks. With trembling, unresponsive fingers, I managed to snap the small vial open. I placed the emergency pill under my tongue and slumped onto the floor, praying it would counteract whatever poison Preston had prescribed. For 10 agonizing minutes, I lay on the Persian rug, staring up at the ornate ceiling of my study, fighting a silent, invisible battle for my own life. Slowly, the crushing weight on my chest began to lift. The numbness in my arm receded to a dull tingle. My vision cleared. The emergency medication was working. I pulled myself up, exhausted, drenched in sweat, but alive. I walked over to the adjoining private bathroom and splashed freezing water on my face. I looked at my reflection in the mirror. I looked old, frail, and exactly like a man on the verge of a massive heart attack. The pill was designed to mimic the exact symptoms of natural heart failure. If I had died, there would be no poison detected on a standard toxicology screen. It would just be another tragic, inevitable end for an elderly billionaire. Cynthia would shed her beautiful, practiced tears at my funeral. She would wear black designer silk instead of red. She would inherit my $80 million empire, and she would spend it with the man who wrote the prescription. I dried my face with a towel. The physical pain in my chest was fading, replaced by a cold, calculating resolve. They had made their move. They had slipped the poison into my home and watched me swallow it. They thought the game was already over. I walked back to my desk and picked up the amber bottle. I dumped the remaining white pills onto the mahogany surface. I needed an independent toxicology report to prove exactly what these were, but I could never take another one. I opened a drawer and retrieved an old bottle of standard vitamin supplements. The capsules were identical in shape, size, and color to Preston's poison. Carefully, methodically, I emptied the toxic pills into a secure plastic evidence bag and refilled the amber bottle with the harmless vitamins. I would take one vitamin every single morning. I would let Cynthia watch me swallow them. I would let her count the decreasing pills in the bottle. I would let her believe that my death was inching closer with every passing day. I needed her to feel perfectly safe, perfectly secure in her imminent victory, because while she was waiting for my heart to stop, I was going to systematically dismantle her entire world. I reached for my secure phone, dialed my private attorney, and prepared to set the trap. The next morning arrived with a suffocating, heavy silence. Though I swapped the toxic capsules for harmless vitamins, the memory of that first pill lingered. My muscles felt leaden. This war was a literal battle for my survival. I had to maintain the illusion of a rapid decline. If I appeared energetic, Cynthia would suspect something was wrong. She would contact her lover, and they would adjust their strategy. I could not afford to let them change the game board before I positioned my own pieces. I practiced a slight, deliberate tremor in my hands as I reached for my wooden cane. I allowed my shoulders to slump, mimicking a man whose heart was giving out. The hardest part was the psychological torment of sharing my sanctuary with a woman who wanted me in a coffin. In the kitchen, the smell of espresso filled the air. Cynthia was pouring coffee into my favorite mug. She wore a soft silk robe looking exactly like the devoted wife she had pretended to be for 2 decades. "Good morning, darling," she said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. She walked over and kissed my cheek. "You look so tired today. Did you sleep well?" I let out a labored sigh, leaning heavily against the counter. "It was a difficult night," I rasped, making my voice sound thin. "My chest feels incredibly tight." Cynthia's eyes widened in a flawless display of concern. She placed a comforting hand on my arm. "Oh, Victor, that breaks my heart. But Dr. Preston said the medication might cause some fatigue at first. We must trust his process. Have you taken your pill today?" I nodded weakly. I was just about to. She retrieved the amber bottle, unscrewed the cap, and shook a single white capsule into her manicured hand. She held it out to me along with a glass of water. I took the pill and the glass. I placed the capsule in my mouth, took a sip of water, and swallowed. Of course, it was just a simple, harmless vitamin, but she did not know that critical detail. Her gaze was fixed on my throat, watching the movement of my swallow with a predatory intensity. It was the look of a hunter watching a trap snap shut. "There," she whispered, taking the empty glass from my trembling hand. "You are going to feel better soon. I promise." I thanked her and slowly shuffled back toward my study. Once the door locked behind me, I dropped the facade. I stood up straight, the tremor in my hands vanishing instantly. I opened the hidden compartment in my desk and placed the real toxic pill into a secure bag. I decided to palm the actual poison whenever possible, just in case she tried to personally administer a dose. Over the next few days, our routine became a macabre, theatrical performance. I would shuffle into the kitchen acting weaker. She would offer her fake sympathies and hand me a vitamin. I would swallow it, and she would smile. But the true depth of her darkness did not reveal itself until the 4th night. I was lying in bed, the room bathed in shadows. I had trained myself to sleep lightly, always listening for the sound of her footsteps. Around 2 in the morning, the heavy bedroom door creaked open. I kept my eyes closed, regulating my breathing into the deep, slow rhythm of a man sedated by a failing heart. I heard the soft rustle of her silk nightgown as she moved across the carpet. She walked directly to my nightstand, where the amber pill bottle sat under the dim glow of the city lights. I opened my eyes just a fraction of an inch, peeking through my eyelashes. Cynthia stood over me. The soft ambient light caught her face, and what I saw chilled me to the bone. There was no love in her expression. There was no pity. There was not even guilt. Her face was a mask of cold, calculating impatience. She reached out with a steady hand and picked up the amber bottle. The plastic rattled softly as she unscrewed the cap. She poured the contents into the palm of her hand, using her slender fingers to count the remaining white capsules. 1, 2, 3, 4. She performed a silent inventory of my impending death. She was verifying that the count was decreasing at the correct rate, ensuring that I was marching steadily toward the grave she and her lover had dug for me. She poured the pills back into the container and tightened the lid with a sharp twist. She set the bottle back on the polished wood, exactly where she had found it. Then she leaned down, her face hovering just inches above mine. I could smell the expensive night cream on her skin. I felt the faint warmth of her breath against my cheek. I kept my breathing slow, my muscles completely relaxed, suppressing every primal instinct that screamed at me to reach up and wrap my hands around her treacherous throat. "Not much longer now, you stubborn old fool," she whispered, her voice devoid of any human warmth. "Just let go, stop fighting it. Miles promised me it would be fast. You owe me this. You owe me everything." She stood up, turned around, and quietly slipped out of the room, leaving the door slightly ajar. The heavy silence returned to the bedroom, pressing down on me like a physical weight. I lay perfectly still in the dark, staring up at the vaulted ceiling, my mind burning with a terrifying absolute clarity. Until that exact moment, a foolish part of me harbored a shred of doubt. A tiny voice had whispered that perhaps I had misunderstood the photograph, that perhaps the toxic reaction to the first pill had been a tragic medical error, a terrible coincidence. I wanted to believe the woman I had slept next to for 20 years was not capable of premeditated murder, but that tiny hopeful whisper was truly dead now. Cynthia had killed it. She had stood over my vulnerable body and actively wished for my heart to stop. She was a predator waiting for her prey to bleed out. The realization struck me with the force of a physical blow wiping away the remnants of the husband I used to be. I was no longer a man dealing with a failing marriage. I was a man trapped in an active crime scene sharing oxygen with my executioner. I slowly sat up in the cold darkness, throwing off the heavy duvet. The weakness was entirely gone, replaced by focused adrenaline. If she wanted me to die, I would give her a ghost. I would become an invisible lethal force inside this penthouse. I reached out for my heavy wooden cane, not to lean on its supportive frame, but to grip it tightly in my fist like a deadly weapon. The gut feeling had evolved into absolute unshakable certainty within my mind. It was finally time to stop playing a weak defense. It was time to start gathering the necessary ammunition I needed to destroy her treacherous world completely. The morning sun broke through the penthouse windows, casting long shadows. I remained in bed, listening to Cynthia preparing for her day. When she walked in, I deepened my breathing and allowed my shoulders to sag against the heavy pillows. I told her I was too exhausted to make it into the office. I explained my chest felt incredibly tight, and I needed rest. Her eyes gleamed with that same predatory excitement. She leaned down smoothly, pressing a rehearsed kiss against my forehead. She whispered she would cancel her luncheon to stay by my side, but I firmly insisted she go. I played the dying husband perfectly. With convincing reluctance, she agreed, promising to return by early afternoon. As soon as the front door clicked shut, I threw off the heavy covers. I locked my private study door and dialed my assistant. I instructed her to completely clear my schedule for 3 days, citing a minor illness. I made sure my voice sounded frail. Rumors of my declining health would reach Derek, feeding their false sense of absolute security. I retrieved the secure plastic evidence bag containing the toxic pills from my hidden desk compartment. I slipped it into my coat pocket, grabbed the keys to a nondescript gray sedan, and slipped out silently through the service elevator. I needed answers, but I could not use any medical facility within Chicago. My name carried entirely too much weight. A billionaire secretly checking his medication for poison would spark a media frenzy and alert Cynthia instantly. I drove south, leaving the towering glass and steel city behind me. My destination was an independent toxicology laboratory across the state line in Indiana. I knew they prioritized absolute discretion above all else. The drive took an hour and a half, giving me ample time to deeply reflect on the sheer absurdity of my situation. I did not inherit a boardroom. 45 years ago, my entire empire consisted of a single rusted delivery truck with a failing transmission. I drove that truck relentlessly through the brutal Chicago winters, hauling heavy freight for 16 grueling hours a day, sleeping in the freezing cab. In the 1980s, the local mob tried to violently squeeze me for protection money. I did not back down. I negotiated my way out through sheer defiance. In the 90s, I faced cutthroat corporate raiders who tried to bleed my growing company dry. I crushed every single one of them. I learned early on that the world only respects absolute power, careful preparation, and an absolute refusal to surrender. I built my empire by being tougher, smarter, and far more relentless than the men who wanted to see me fail. Now my greatest threat was not a ruthless mob boss. It was a cowardly doctor wielding a prescription pad and a treacherous woman I had showered with expensive diamonds. I survived the worst the business world had to throw at me. I absolutely refused to be taken down by amateur opportunists. I pulled into the quiet industrial park in Indiana. The private laboratory was housed in a modest brick building with darkly tinted windows. I walked inside confidently, presenting myself to the professional at the front desk. I did not use my real name. I paid a substantial expedited processing fee in untraceable cash, demanding the head toxicologist analyze the chemical composition of the mysterious capsules immediately. I took a seat in the sterile waiting room. The agonizing wait felt eternal. Every slow minute stretched into an absolute eternity as I sat on a rigid plastic chair sipping stale coffee. I focused my active mind on the complex logistics of my upcoming counterattack, treating this family betrayal exactly like a highly hostile corporate infiltration. After 3 tense hours, the double doors of the secure lab swung open. The head toxicologist, an older man with tired eyes and a stained white coat, walked toward me holding a thick manila folder. He asked me into his private office, his serious expression completely grave and unreadable. He sat down heavily behind his cluttered desk and deliberately opened the confidential file. He directly asked me where I had unfortunately obtained these specific capsules. I firmly told him it was a strictly personal matter of extreme confidentiality. He nodded slowly, fully respecting the boundary. He quietly told me that whoever had maliciously formulated these particular pills possessed a highly sophisticated, dangerous understanding of cardiovascular pharmacology. These were absolutely not traditional heart medications. They were not designed to gently regulate a mild arrhythmia. The intelligent toxicologist pointed directly to a complex chemical breakdown, boldly printed on the bright white paper. He thoroughly explained that the capsules contained a highly concentrated, very dangerous synthetic compound. It was specifically engineered to act as a silent, completely invisible internal accelerant. Once ingested, the toxic compound would slowly bind to the sensitive vascular walls, ultimately causing a progressive, severe, and deadly spike in blood pressure. It was maliciously designed to force the struggling heart to work exponentially harder while simultaneously constricting the vital arteries. He looked me dead in the eye and clearly delivered the absolute, terrifying medical truth. If an older man with a pre-existing, relatively mild heart condition were to mistakenly take these dangerous pills daily, his cardiovascular system would be subjected to utterly catastrophic physical stress. Within exactly 2 to 3 short weeks, the cumulative internal effect would undoubtedly induce a massive, entirely fatal myocardial infarction. A sudden heart attack so incredibly severe and physically destructive that medical survival would be virtually impossible. But the most truly chilling detail was the underlying chemistry itself. The lethal compound was perfectly synthesized to metabolize and completely break down within a few short hours of the fatal cardiac event. It would leave absolutely no detectable chemical residue in the human bloodstream or the surrounding organ tissues. If I had actually died, a standard post-mortem medical autopsy would show absolutely nothing out of the ordinary. The assigned medical examiner would easily conclude that I had simply succumbed to natural age-related heart failure. It was the absolute perfect, utterly untraceable murder weapon. I sat rigidly in the leather chair, quietly absorbing the clinical, cold, scientific confirmation of my impending, carefully planned execution. Cynthia and Miles had not just secretly hoped I would somehow die. They had meticulously orchestrated a flawless, completely undetectable assassination. The timeline hit me like a solid physical blow. Within exactly 2 to 3 weeks, the smart toxicologist had said, if I had unknowingly swallowed that very first pill yesterday and foolishly continued the dangerous regimen, I would be completely dead before the end of the current month. I sincerely thanked. The scientist took the official lab report and walked directly back out to my waiting car. The midday sun felt strangely cold against my skin. I tossed the thick manila folder onto the empty passenger seat The lingering gut feeling was entirely gone forever. I now physically held the undeniable concrete scientific proof of their treacherous murder plot right in my hands. I was officially a marked man, but they had fundamentally miscalculated their exact timeline. They arrogantly thought I was a fragile, clueless victim, waiting quietly for the bitter end. They did not realize that I had just effectively weaponized their entire conspiracy against them. I started the powerful engine tightly gripping the steering wheel as a cold, deeply calculating fury washed completely over my mind. The defensive phase of this brutal war was officially over. It was time to start setting traps. On the third evening of this newly established surveillance operation, I finally locked myself inside my private study under the pretense of intense, overwhelming fatigue. The heavy, solid oak doors effectively sealed me in complete, comforting silence, away from the constant, watchful eyes of my treacherous wife. I slowly sat down at my massive, custom-built wooden desk and deliberately opened my highly encrypted laptop. The tiny biometric scanner glowed brightly for a brief second, verifying my unique fingerprint, before silently granting me total, unrestricted access to the digital panopticon my private security team had flawlessly installed throughout the penthouse. I took a very slow, incredibly deep breath, mentally bracing my aging mind for the disgusting, painful reality I was about to actively consume. I specifically navigated my cursor to the hidden audio files secretly recorded earlier that very same afternoon in the main, sprawling living room. I fully genuinely expected to hear Cynthia making a secret hushed phone call to Dr. Miles Preston. I eagerly anticipated hearing her coldly detail my beautifully faked physical struggles and perhaps complain loudly about exactly how stubbornly I was clinging to my fading life. I carefully adjusted my secure noise-canceling headphones over my ears, staring blankly at the erratic digital audio waves moving quickly across the bright, high-resolution screen. The crystal-clear recording began smoothly, with the familiar, everyday soft sounds of the luxury penthouse. I clearly heard the faint, distant hum of the busy city traffic far below through the thick, soundproof glass windows. I heard the steady, rhythmic ticking of the antique grandfather clock standing proudly in the marble hallway. Then the heavy front door suddenly opened loudly and clicked shut with a sharp, echoing thud. Heavy, remarkably hurried footsteps echoed rapidly across the polished marble foyer. It was absolutely not the confident, smooth, arrogant stride of a wealthy elite cardiologist. These frantic steps were completely erratic, clearly fueled by sheer, unadulterated panic. I heard Cynthia speak first. Her tone was incredibly sharp, completely devoid of the sweet, sickeningly loving cadence she constantly used whenever she interacted with me. She angrily demanded to know exactly why the unexpected visitor had recklessly come directly to the apartment in the middle of the afternoon, without calling first. The responding voice made the blood freeze solidly in my veins for the absolute second time that miserable week. It was Derek, my 30-year-old son, the chief operating officer of my entire corporate empire. The very boy I had personally raised, extensively educated, and carefully groomed to smoothly inherit every single thing I had spent 40 grueling years building from absolute scratch. His voice was violently trembling, pitched unusually high with an undeniable, pathetic, sickening desperation. I could distinctly hear him pacing frantically back and forth across the expensive hardwood floor. He completely ignored Cynthia's angry, hushed reprimand and began speaking in a frantic, terrifyingly rushed outburst. "How much longer, Cynthia?" Derek demanded, his words tumbling over each other in sheer terror. "The crypto guys are threatening to break my legs. You said the doctor's pills would work fast." I sat perfectly still in my dark leather chair. My large hands were pressed flat on the smooth desk, pressing down so incredibly hard my aging joints physically ached. My own son intimately knew about the poisoned medication. My own flesh and blood was actively relying on my imminent, agonizingly painful death to quickly cover his massive hidden financial failures. Cynthia replied with a cold, terrifying, sociopathic authority that sent shivers down my spine. "Patience," she hissed at him. her voice dripping with venomous calculation. "If he dies too fast, there's an autopsy. We get $80 million in a month. Just hold off your thugs." The audio file relentlessly continued to play flawlessly, capturing the disgusting, hushed, conspiratorial argument between my treacherous wife and my treacherous son. But the sudden roaring ringing in my ears nearly drowned out the rest of their vile words. I very slowly removed the heavy headphones and placed them gently on the desk. I did not yell. I did not violently throw anything across the room. I simply stared straight at the blank white wall, feeling an absolute, crushing, devastating weight violently descend upon my chest. This specific betrayal was infinitely worse than the terrible realization back in the doctor's office. Cynthia was just my second wife. We had shared 20 long years, but she was still essentially an outsider who had grown dangerously, murderously greedy. But Derek was my actual legacy. I had joyfully held him in the hospital delivery room the day he was born. I had patiently taught him how to ride a bicycle in the public park. I had proudly watched him graduate with honors from a prestigious business school, genuinely believing I had successfully raised a strong, highly capable, honorable man. I had officially handed him the operational keys to my massive kingdom, completely trusting him to lead the prosperous company into the next successful generation. Instead, he was absolutely nothing but a weak, pathetic, cowardly parasite. He was entirely willing to stand by and watch me violently choke on a fatal heart attack, just to hastily pay off his illegal underground gambling debts. The sheer magnitude of the catastrophic double betrayal threatened to completely suffocate my normally highly logical mind. They were actively working together. The woman who slept peacefully in my bed, and the boy who proudly carried my last name, had secretly formed a lethal, unbreakable alliance against my life. They viewed my entire existence as nothing more than an inconvenient temporary obstacle standing directly between them and my massive hard-earned bank accounts. The profound, crippling grief I deeply felt for the complete loss of my only son lasted exactly 10 excruciating silent minutes. As I sat completely alone in the dimming, quiet light of the private study, the heavy mourning rapidly evaporated. It was instantly replaced by a deep, incredibly dark, and utterly merciless, burning fury. I quickly realized that Derek had not just fundamentally betrayed me as a loving father. He had fundamentally betrayed the entire company I had literally bled to build over 4 decades. His unforgivable actions were a direct insult to everything I stood for. If he was currently millions of dollars in severe debt to violent, dangerous criminals, he was a massive walking liability to the entire corporate structure. He was not just plotting my personal murder. He was actively, recklessly endangering the secure livelihoods of thousands of hard-working, loyal employees who genuinely depended on my business for their families. I aggressively opened a secondary secure digital portal on my laptop. I expertly bypassed the corporate firewall to directly access the firm's confidential ledgers. I urgently needed to see exactly how much catastrophic damage my son had already secretly caused behind my back. I needed to meticulously track every single stolen dollar he had illegally touched. The immense emotional devastation was now locked away inside a cold, impenetrable steel mental vault. They desperately wanted to play a deadly high-stakes game for $80 million. I was going to ensure that neither of them walked away with a single miserable dime. I stared at the glowing screen of my heavily encrypted laptop, the pale light casting sharp shadows across the mahogany desk. The suffocating grief of a betrayed father had been entirely replaced by the cold, calculating precision of a veteran chief executive officer preparing for absolute war. Derek was not just a massive, heartbreaking, personal disappointment. He was an active, malignant tumor, aggressively spreading through the core of my life's work. I had spent 4 grueling decades building an $80 million logistics empire from absolutely nothing. I had fought off ruthless corporate raiders and aggressive hostile takeovers. Now the most dangerous, insidious threat I had ever faced was sitting comfortably in my own penthouse, casually discussing my premeditated murder with my treacherous wife. This was no longer just a desperate fight for my physical survival. It was a brutal high-stakes battle for my entire legacy. Derek had foolishly mentioned his violent cryptocurrency creditors on the hidden audio recording. He was drowning in terrifying underground debt, and he was desperately trying to buy time for the poison to finally stop my heart. But waiting for me to die was clearly not his only financial strategy. If he was stalling violent men who threatened to physically break his legs, he had to be throwing them a substantial financial bone to keep them satisfied. He certainly did not have the personal wealth to manage that heavy payoff. He was using my money. He was actively bleeding my company dry. My fingers moved rapidly and silently across the specialized keyboard. I bypassed the standard executive security protocols and accessed the deeply buried, highly classified master ledgers of the corporation. As the chief operating officer, Derek possessed high-level clearance, but he fundamentally lacked the absolute foundational system access that I had personally engineered into the secure digital architecture decades ago. He arrogantly believed his digital footprints were completely invisible. He was wrong. I began a meticulous forensic digital audit of every corporate transaction processed over the past 8 months. I started by scanning the primary operational accounts, looking for large, unexplained outward capital flows. At first glance, everything appeared perfectly normal. The standard payroll was met, the massive logistics contracts were fully funded, and our standard quarterly earnings looked relatively stable. But I knew exactly how greedy, desperate men operated when their backs were pressed firmly against a wall. They never stole from the brightly lit, highly visible main accounts. They always hid their dirty work deep within the shadows of the complex secondary ledgers. I shifted my intense focus to our international logistics division, a massive complex subsidiary that handled hundreds of high-value shipments across multiple global borders every day. The sheer volume of daily transactions made it the perfect chaotic place to hide a systematic, slow-moving theft. I applied a specialized algorithmic filter, deliberately searching for rapid recurring payments made to brand new, completely unknown vendor accounts. Within 20 tense minutes, the ugly truth began to materialize on the bright screen. I found the very first glaring anomaly buried deeply within a routine quarterly expense report. It was a completely unauthorized payment of $400,000 allocated to a mysterious consulting firm called Apex Global Solutions. I immediately cross-referenced the unknown vendor name against our approved corporate database. The company did not exist. There was no legitimate record of their services, no official point of contact, and no authorized vendor approval form. It was a complete ghost. My heart pounded with a cold, rhythmic fury as I dug even deeper into the tangled digital web my son had woven. Over the incredibly painful course of 3 hours, I systematically uncovered a massive, sprawling network of fraudulent corporate contracts. Derek had secretly created 12 different, completely fake shell companies. He had been quietly funneling massive amounts of untraceable corporate capital directly into these invisible offshore accounts for the past 6 months. He was drafting fake invoices for imaginary supply chain optimization studies, non-existent digital security upgrades, and completely fabricated international shipping tariffs. He was ruthlessly signing these ghost contracts, using his immense operational authority, silently bypassing the standard financial review boards by cleverly keeping each individual payment just a few $1,000s below the mandatory executive audit threshold. It was a highly sophisticated, meticulously planned embezzlement operation. He had already stolen nearly $4 million of my hard-earned capital, but $4 million was clearly not enough to permanently satisfy the violent, dangerous underground creditors he had so foolishly entangled himself with. He had squandered millions on highly volatile, incredibly stupid cryptocurrency investments that had completely crashed, leaving him exposed to ruthless men who did not care about corporate titles or fancy degrees. They only cared about absolute immediate payment. The ghost contracts were simply a desperate temporary stalling tactic. He was frantically siphoning just enough company blood to keep the violent wolves away from his door, while he impatiently waited for my heart to give out. I leaned back in the heavy leather chair, the bright monitor reflecting in my cold eyes. The absolute scale of his treacherous betrayal was truly breathtaking. He was actively destroying the incredibly prosperous, stable company that employed thousands of hard-working, innocent people. He was perfectly willing to let my entire logistical empire crash into total ruin just to selfishly save his own pathetic skin. He truly believed he could simply inherit the remaining $80 million, easily cover his massive illegal tracks, and walk away as a wealthy, unbothered king. I meticulously downloaded every fraudulent contract, every fake invoice, and every single digital wire transfer record onto a highly secure, heavily encrypted external drive. I was gathering the exact, undeniable ammunition I needed to completely decimate him in a court of law. But simply sending my only son to federal prison for massive corporate fraud was no longer a sufficient punishment. It was entirely too quick. It was entirely too easy. He had deliberately conspired with my wife to murder me in cold blood. He had actively cheered for my agonizing death. I needed him to suffer absolute destruction. I needed to expertly string him along, making him genuinely believe his incredibly vile, murderous plan was working flawlessly. I had to continue playing the weak, dying old man, coughing pathetically in the living room, while I secretly dismantled his entire life behind the heavy oak doors of my study. I reached back into the secure system and silently placed highly advanced invisible tracking algorithms on every single one of his fraudulent shell accounts. The very next time he desperately tried to move a single stolen penny to his violent creditors, I would know it instantly. The digital clock on my laptop displayed 4 a.m. The sprawling penthouse was silent, but my mind was operating at a terrifying, brilliant speed. I closed the laptop and placed the encrypted drive into my hidden safe. I stood up, gripping my wooden cane, preparing to step back out onto the brightly lit stage. The sun would be rising soon, and I needed to be ready to greet my treacherous wife and my murderous son with a frail, dying smile. The morning sun cast a cold glare across the penthouse. I emerged from my bedroom, leaning on my wooden cane, my hands trembling with practiced precision. Cynthia was in the kitchen, sipping espresso. Derek was sitting at the island, casually eating toast as if he had not just plotted my murder. I offered them both a frail, dying smile. Derek looked at me with fake concern, asking how I felt. I rasped that my chest was a cage of pain, and I urgently needed to get my affairs in order. I retreated to the living room and dialed Mitchell Crawford. He was my bulldog attorney, a ruthless, brilliant legal mind who had defended my corporate empire for 2 decades. I told him to cancel his appointments and come directly to the penthouse. I said it was a matter of life and death. I needed his secure laptop and a portable printer. While waiting, I reviewed the placement of the hidden audio transmitters the security team had installed. One sat directly above the seating area in my study, perfectly positioned to capture every single syllable spoken. I needed Cynthia and Derek to hear exactly what I was about to do. I needed them to believe their sinister timeline was aligning perfectly with my own terrified paranoia. Mitchell arrived an hour later, carrying his heavy leather briefcase. His sharp eyes took in my weakened posture and the wool blanket draped over my legs. He followed me into the study, closing the heavy oak doors behind us. I did not bother turning on the white noise generator I usually used for legal discussions. I wanted this entire conversation broadcast loud and clear. I sank into my leather chair and let out a long, ragged sigh. "Mitchell," I said, pitching my voice to carry a heavy, undeniable fear. "My heart is giving out. The doctors are not optimistic. I can feel my physical body failing me with every single beat. I need a new will drafted immediately, right here, right now." Mitchell frowned, pulling a yellow legal pad from his briefcase. He reminded me that we had just updated my estate plan 6 months ago, setting up a complex trust that heavily restricted Derek's access to the capital and explicitly outlined a pending divorce settlement for Cynthia. "Burn that old document," I commanded, raising my voice to ensure the hidden microphone caught the absolute desperation in my tone. "I do not have time for trusts or restrictions. I want them taken care of immediately. Draft a new document. I want 100% of my assets, all corporate voting rights, the logistics empire, the offshore accounts, and this entire real estate portfolio split straight down the middle. Exactly 50% to my devoted wife Cynthia, and exactly 50% to my son Derek. Mitchell stared at me as if I had completely lost my mind. He leaned across the mahogany desk, lowering his voice. He asked me if I was absolutely certain, reminding me of Derek's reckless financial history and Cynthia's highly questionable loyalty. He urged me to carefully reconsider, to protect the vital corporate voting rights, to ensure the company survived my passing. I slammed my fist onto the desk, a sudden burst of manufactured anger, to sell the absolute panic of a dying man. "Do not argue with me, Mitchell," I shouted, my voice cracking perfectly. "I am dying. They are my only family. They are the only ones taking care of me in my final days. I want them to have absolute, unrestricted control the second my heart completely stops. Print the draft right now." Mitchell shook his head slowly, clearly disturbed by my sudden, irrational, emotional state. But he was my attorney, and he respectfully followed my direct orders. He opened his laptop, connected the small portable printer, and began typing rapidly. For 20 minutes, the only sound in the private study was the rapid clicking of his keyboard and my incredibly labored breathing. Finally, the printer whirred to life, spitting out crisp white pages of complex legal jargon that effectively surrendered my entire life's work to the two greedy monsters who actively wanted me dead. Mitchell placed the freshly printed document directly on my desk. He pointed to the signature lines, silently offering me his heavy gold pen. "Leave it," I whispered, slumping back in my chair and closing my eyes, as if the mere act of arguing had completely exhausted my failing heart. "I need to read it over carefully tonight. I need to make sure the language is completely ironclad. You can return tomorrow morning, and I will sign it then in front of a public notary." Mitchell reluctantly packed up his equipment. He gave me a long, sad look, completely convinced he was watching a great man succumb to the terrifying weakness of mortality. I thanked him and asked him to see himself out. The moment the study doors closed behind him, I smoothly sat up straight. The pathetic weakness vanished from my posture. I picked up the stack of papers and placed them perfectly in the center of my dark mahogany desk, ensuring the bold heading detailing the 50% asset split was completely visible. It was the ultimate piece of irresistible bait, perfectly laid out for a pair of starving predators. I quietly walked to my private bathroom, locked the door, and pulled out my encrypted security tablet. I tapped into the hidden camera network, focusing the feed directly on the heavy oak doors of my study. I did not have to wait long. Less than 30 minutes after Mitchell left the penthouse, the study door slowly creaked open. Cynthia slipped into the room, looking over her shoulder to ensure the hallway was empty. She moved with the silent, practiced grace of a seasoned thief. She glided directly toward my desk, her eyes locking instantly onto the crisp white pages of the drafted will. I watched through the high-definition lens as she leaned over the document. Her manicured fingers traced the exact lines where her name and Derek's name were printed next to the words, granting them total, unrestricted control of $80 million. The subtle, wicked smirk I had grown to despise slowly spread across her beautiful face, blossoming into a full, genuine smile of absolute triumph. She quickly pulled her silver smartphone from her pocket. She held it steady over the desk, snapping clear, high-resolution photographs of every single page. She was undoubtedly sending those images straight to Derek and Dr. Miles, providing them with absolute proof that their vile conspiracy was working perfectly. They had successfully terrorized me into handing over the entire kingdom just moments before my expected execution. I watched her slip back out of the study, completely unaware that she had just swallowed a massive hook. They thought they had finally won the war. They thought the massive fortune was already sitting securely in their bank accounts. They would drop their guard now. They would become incredibly arrogant, comfortable, and incredibly careless. And that was exactly when I would strike, tearing their false victory away and burying them under the crushing weight of their monumental greed. I waited quietly in the master bathroom for a full hour before returning to my private study. The heavy oak doors were firmly shut exactly as I had left them. I walked over to the mahogany desk and glanced down at the freshly printed draft of my new will. To the untrained eye, it looked completely untouched. But I had spent 40 years reading human behavior. I could practically feel the toxic residue of Cynthia hovering over the crisp, white pages. She had taken the bait perfectly. I sat down in my leather executive chair and unlocked my secure, encrypted laptop. I brought up the master dashboard for the hidden surveillance web. I fully expected to intercept a celebratory conference call. I assumed she would immediately dial my treacherous son and her murderous cardiologist to boast about their imminent financial victory. I put on my secure noise-canceling headphones, preparing to listen to them gleefully divide my $80 million empire. I located her live video feed. She was pacing back and forth inside her massive custom closet surrounded by designer dresses I had purchased for her. She raised her silver smartphone to her ear. The ringing tone echoed softly through the hidden microphone embedded in the ceiling fixture. A deep, professional male voice answered on the second ring. It was not the familiar, arrogant tone of Dr. Miles Preston. It was certainly not the desperate, panic-stricken voice of my cowardly son, Derek. "Gregory speaking," the man said smoothly. I recognized the voice instantly. Gregory Harrison was a notoriously ruthless, highly aggressive private attorney who specialized in hostile asset recovery and high-conflict divorces. He was a legal mercenary, a man who destroyed lives for a hefty retainer. "Gregory, it is Cynthia," she said, her voice dropping to a low, conspiratorial whisper. The old fool just had a complete breakdown. He brought his bulldog attorney to the penthouse an hour ago. He completely rewrote the estate plan. He left exactly 50% of everything to me and 50% to Derek. He even included full corporate voting rights. Gregory let out a low, satisfied chuckle. "That is excellent news, Cynthia. The new draft makes our next legal maneuver significantly easier. How long until his cardiovascular system finally gives out?" 2 weeks, maybe 3, Cynthia replied coldly. "He looks terrible. The synthetic compound is working exactly as Miles promised, but we need to finalize our secondary strategy. I refuse to share a single miserable dime of that $80 million with a pathetic degenerate like Derek." I sat completely frozen in my study, the breath catching sharply in my throat. I had believed Cynthia and Derek were solid co-conspirators, unified by their shared greed. I was wrong. I was listening to a vicious triple cross that defied human comprehension. "We are perfectly positioned to eliminate Derek," Gregory stated calmly. "Have you secured the digital evidence regarding his recent offshore financial activities?" "I have everything," Cynthia hissed, a dark thrill coloring her words. "I hired a private forensic accountant 3 months ago. I knew that foolish boy was drowning in massive underground gambling debts. I let him panic. I watched him create those 12 fake shell companies. I let him sign those ghost contracts using Victor's forged signature. I have complete, undeniable proof that Derek embezzled nearly $4 million directly from the logistics empire." My mind reeled. Cynthia had known about the corporate theft all along. She had actively allowed my company to bleed out because it served her ultimate purpose. "Perfect," Gregory replied. "The moment Victor passes away and the new will is officially executed, I will anonymously trigger a massive federal audit of the Logistics Corporation. We will hand the entire file over to the federal authorities. Derek will be instantly indicted for massive corporate fraud, embezzlement, and money laundering. He will be facing 20 years in federal prison. To secure a plea deal, he will be forced to forfeit his entire 50% inheritance back to the primary estate. You will absorb his entire share legally and cleanly." Cynthia laughed softly, a terrifying sound that echoed clearly through my headphones. "He is such a stupid, arrogant boy. He actually thinks we are partners. He actually thinks I am going to help him pay off his violent cryptocurrency thugs, let him rot in a federal cell." I closed my eyes, absorbing the sheer sociopathic magnitude of her dark ambition. But she was not finished. The deep web of her betrayal extended much further than my son. "And what about the good doctor?" Gregory asked, his tone shifting to a strictly analytical register. Miles Preston is a significant loose end. He knows the exact synthetic compound used to stop Victor's heart. He formulated the poison. He could easily blackmail you for millions over the next decade. Have you secured the leverage to permanently neutralize him? Cynthia's voice hardened into absolute freezing steel. Miles is a lovesick, completely spineless idiot. He thinks we are going to run away to the French Riviera and spend the rest of our lives together. He has absolutely no idea what is coming for him. Do you have the physical evidence? Gregory pressed. I kept everything, she replied triumphantly. I kept the original handwritten prescription pads he used to authorize the toxic capsules. I kept the encrypted text messages where he detailed the chemical breakdown of the compound. I even have a secret audio recording of him admitting that the medication would artificially induce a fatal myocardial infarction without leaving any chemical trace during a standard autopsy. I gripped the armrests of my chair, my knuckles turning bright white. She had meticulously documented the entire murder plot, creating a perfect, undeniable paper trail of guilt that pointed exclusively to her own lover. The moment Victor is buried, I will act the part of the devastated, suspicious widow. Cynthia continued, her voice dripping with cruel excitement. I will bring those original prescription pads directly to the medical board and the district attorney. I will claim I found them hidden in his office. I will tearfully testify that Dr. Miles Preston deliberately administered the wrong medication to my beloved husband. I will sue him for gross medical malpractice and push the district attorney to file first-degree manslaughter charges. He will go to prison for the rest of his natural life. Gregory noted, sounding genuinely impressed by her profound wickedness. He will be completely discredited. Even if he tries to drag you down with him, no jury will ever believe a convicted, disgraced doctor over a weeping, traumatized widow who courageously exposed his fatal medical errors. Exactly, Cynthia whispered. Derek goes to federal prison for corporate embezzlement. Miles goes to maximum security prison for medical manslaughter. And I walk away with 100% of the $80 million estate, the corporate voting rights, and absolute freedom. The audio feed clicked silently as the phone call ended. I sat in the dark study staring at the screen. I slowly removed the heavy headphones. I was no longer just fighting two foolish, greedy opportunists. I was fighting a brilliant, truly merciless monster. The brutal counterattack begins right now. The absolute magnitude of Cynthia's depravity settled over me like a heavy shroud. I was not dealing with an unfaithful wife or a greedy opportunist. I was cohabitating with a calculating sociopath. She had manipulated my cowardly son into committing massive corporate fraud, only to construct a tailored federal cage to lock him inside. She had seduced an arrogant cardiologist into formulating a lethal, untraceable poison, intending to hand him over to the district attorney the second my heart stopped beating. She was going to destroy every single person who stood in her path, and she was going to do it with a beautiful, tragic smile on her face. I sat in the silent darkness of my private study, fully realizing that a simple divorce or a standard corporate termination would never be enough. I needed to engineer a catastrophic, inescapable collision of all her carefully laid plans. I needed to trap all three of them in the exact same room and let the heavy doors of justice slam shut permanently. The following morning, I contacted my bulldog attorney, Mitchell Crawford. I told him to completely disregard the fake will I had forced him to draft the previous day. Instead, I demanded he secure an immediate confidential meeting with the district attorney and the head of the Federal Financial Crimes Division. Mitchell was severely confused by my sudden, miraculous recovery, but he did exactly as he was heavily compensated to do. We met in a sterile, windowless conference room deep inside a secure federal building in downtown Chicago. I did not waste a single second on pleasantries. I placed the thick manila folder containing the independent Indiana toxicology report directly in the center of the large metal table. I clearly explained how the synthetic compound was maliciously engineered to induce a massive fatal myocardial infarction without leaving any chemical trace. Next, I handed the federal agents the heavy encrypted drive containing the absolute, undeniable proof of my son's massive corporate embezzlement. I showed them the 12 fake shell companies, the ghost contracts, and the rapid offshore wire transfers. Finally, I played the high-definition audio recordings captured by my private security team. I let the district attorney listen to Derek desperately begging for more time to pay off his violent cryptocurrency thugs. Then I played the ultimate audio file. I forced the room to listen to Cynthia coldly outlining her masterful triple cross to her ruthless private lawyer. The absolute silence in the federal conference room was deafening. The seasoned prosecutors were genuinely stunned by the sheer, terrifying scale of the intricate conspiracy. Within 2 intense hours, we had constructed a flawless, completely airtight legal strategy. The authorities would secure the necessary arrest warrants for attempted murder, massive corporate fraud, and medical malpractice. But I had one strict, non-negotiable condition. The ultimate arrests had to happen on my exact terms, on my specific timeline, and on my private property. I returned to the penthouse late that afternoon, intentionally dragging my left leg and leaning heavily on my wooden cane. Cynthia greeted me in the foyer, her eyes searching my pale face for any visible signs of my rapidly approaching death. I offered her a frail, completely exhausted smile. I reached out, taking her soft hands in my trembling ones. I told her that my physical strength was fading much faster than I had ever anticipated. I rasped that my time was incredibly short, but before I passed away, I wanted to experience one final beautiful evening, surrounded by the people I loved. I informed her that I was hosting a grand formal dinner party at the penthouse that very weekend. It would serve as a joint celebration of our 20th wedding anniversary and the official announcement of my complete permanent retirement from the logistics empire. Cynthia's eyes widened in a fleeting moment of genuine shock. She quickly tried to gently dissuade me, cooing that such a massive event would be far too physically taxing for my failing heart. But I remained absolutely resolute, playing the stubborn, dying patriarch to absolute perfection. I insisted that the catering be flawless, the champagne be vintage, and the guest list be strictly limited to our intimate inner circle. My first required target was my treacherous son. I summoned Derek to the penthouse living room the next morning. He stood near the floor-to-ceiling windows, shifting nervously from foot to foot, clearly terrified that his violent creditors were closing in on him. I looked up at him from my velvet armchair, deliberately making my breathing sound shallow and heavily strained. I told him that his reckless behavior was entirely forgiven. I lied and said that I finally recognized his true corporate brilliance. I firmly demanded his absolute presence at the upcoming anniversary dinner, strongly implying that I would be officially signing the final transition documents, handing him total unrestricted control of the $80 million corporation in front of the assembled guests. The visible wave of intense, desperate relief that washed over his pale face was truly sickening to witness. He eagerly promised to be there, entirely convinced that his immediate financial salvation was finally within his greedy grasp. The final, most crucial piece of my elaborate trap required absolute finesse. While Cynthia was arranging fresh flowers in the kitchen, I loudly dialed Dr. Miles Preston on speakerphone. The cardiologist answered with his usual arrogant, smooth, professional tone. I projected a deep, trembling vulnerability into my aging voice. I told the good doctor that his prescribed medication had severely drained my energy, but I was incredibly grateful for his dedicated, unwavering care. I insisted that he attend the formal anniversary dinner as my special, highly honored VIP guest. I loudly proclaimed that I wanted to publicly toast the brilliant medical mind who was working so tirelessly to manage my failing heart. Cynthia froze completely still by the marble kitchen island. The heavy crystal vase in her hands trembled visibly. The absolute last thing a calculating murderer wants is for all of her intended victims and secret accomplices to be gathered together in the exact same brightly lit room. She urgently stepped forward desperately, trying to interject, trying to subtly signal her secret lover to decline the dangerous invitation. But Dr. Miles Preston possessed an ego entirely too massive for his own good. He greedily absorbed my fake, lavish praise. He smoothly accepted the invitation, promising to bring his finest bottle of wine to celebrate my ongoing treatment. I ended the phone call and looked directly at my terrified wife. She was staring at me with wide, panicked blue eyes, unable to articulate a single coherent objection without exposing her own underlying guilt. The hidden cameras captured the cold sweat breaking out across her flawless forehead. She was officially trapped in my web. She had spent months meticulously planning my quiet, invisible murder. Now I had successfully forced her onto a brilliantly illuminated stage directly alongside the foolish son she planned to bankrupt and the arrogant doctor she planned to imprison. The grand dining room table was perfectly set for a magnificent feast, but they had no idea they were the ones on the menu. The evening of our 20th anniversary arrived with a heavy storm brewing over the Chicago skyline. Rain lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse, creating a rhythmic drumming that perfectly masked the profound, suffocating tension building inside the grand dining room. The mahogany table was set with our finest crystal and polished silver gleaming under the warm glow of the custom chandeliers. I knew those same chandeliers were currently broadcasting every single sound directly to a secure digital server monitored by federal agents. I stood in the marble foyer waiting for my honored guests to arrive. I had dressed in a sharply tailored dark charcoal suit. For the first time in 3 weeks, I did not lean on my heavy wooden cane. I left it resting against the wall, a discarded prop from a play that was rapidly coming to its final act. Cynthia emerged from the master suite wearing a stunning floor-length emerald gown. She had adorned herself with the diamond necklace I had purchased for her in Paris 10 years ago. She was the absolute picture of a loving, radiant hostess, completely oblivious to the federal trap closing tightly around her. She paused when she saw me standing tall and completely unsupported. A brief flicker of genuine confusion crossed her beautiful face. I smiled warmly and offered my arm, telling her that the excitement of the evening had miraculously given me a sudden burst of energy. She masked her unease with a tight smile, linking her arm through mine just as the private elevator doors chimed open. My son Derek was the first to step into the foyer. He looked like a man walking directly toward an execution squad. His expensive tuxedo hung loosely on his frame, his face pale and shining with a thin layer of cold sweat. His hands were shaking so violently he could barely manage to hand his damp overcoat to the waiting attendant. I greeted him with a firm, powerful handshake, pulling him close and patting his back with deliberate force. He flinched visibly. I knew exactly why he was terrified. His underground cryptocurrency creditors had undoubtedly given him a final brutal ultimatum. He was desperately waiting for me to announce my retirement and sign over the corporate assets tonight, completely unaware that those same assets were currently locked down by the government. A few moments later, Dr. Miles Preston arrived. He strode into my home with an unbearable, sickening arrogance. He wore a velvet dinner jacket and carried a rare, incredibly expensive bottle of vintage Bordeaux. He presented the wine to Cynthia with a lingering, deeply intimate gaze that made my blood run absolutely cold. He turned to me, his face arranging itself into a mask of solemn medical concern. He softly asked how I was managing the intense fatigue caused by my new heart medication. I looked him dead in the eye, my posture perfectly straight, my voice resonating with an undeniable booming strength. I told him that I had never felt more alive, more awake, or more incredibly focused in my entire life. Dr. Preston blinked, completely taken aback by my booming voice and steady gaze. He quickly recovered smoothly, suggesting that it was merely a temporary surge of adrenaline and strongly advising me not to overexert my fragile cardiovascular system. I laughed, a deep booming sound that echoed sharply off the marble walls, and confidently led the way into the grand dining room. I took my seat at the head of the long table. Cynthia sat to my immediate right, Derek to my left, and Dr. Preston directly across from me. We were an intimate, deadly circle of 4. The private chef began serving the first course, a delicate lobster bisque. I ate with a voracious, completely uninhibited appetite. I savored every single bite, scraping my bowl clean, while my three guests merely pushed the rich food around their expensive porcelain plates. Derek kept his smartphone resting directly on the table next to his crystal water glass. The screen illuminated every few minutes with incoming messages. Each bright flash made him visibly flinch. I calmly poured the vintage Bordeaux Dr. Preston had brought while ensuring every glass was perfectly full. I raised my own glass, demanding a toast to family, to health, and to the profound virtue of absolute loyalty. I took a long sip of the dark wine and set my glass down, fixing my gaze entirely on my sweating son. I casually noted how incredibly stressful the modern corporate world had become. I spoke in a smooth conversational tone about the dangerous pitfalls of reckless financial ambition. I mentioned how easily young, arrogant executives could drown in hidden, unmanageable debts if they engaged with the wrong underground elements. Derek dropped his heavy silver spoon. It clattered loudly against his porcelain bowl. He stared at me, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. He stuttered out a weak agreement, desperately grabbing his wineglass with both shaking hands and taking a massive gulp to hide his sheer terror. I smoothly shifted my intense gaze directly toward Dr. Miles Preston. I smiled politely and asked him about the heavy burden of medical responsibility. I wondered aloud how a highly educated, deeply trusted physician could peacefully sleep at night, knowing he held the absolute power of life and death in his hands. I casually pondered the severe moral implications of a doctor deliberately betraying his sacred oath to engage in completely poisonous, destructive relationships. I used the word poisonous very deliberately, letting it hang heavily in the quiet air between us. Dr. Preston shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his arrogant smirk faltering slightly. He cleared his throat and offered a generic, rehearsed platitude about always prioritizing the profound well-being of his vulnerable patients. Cynthia tried desperately to intervene expertly, attempting to steer the heavy conversation back to lighter topics. She cheerfully brought up our upcoming retirement plans, aggressively trying to force the evening back onto her meticulously orchestrated script. She nervously asked if I was still prepared to make my grand announcement after the main course was served. I turned my head and looked at the woman who had spent months plotting to murder me and subsequently frame her own lover to steal my entire fortune. I told her that I was absolutely prepared to reveal everything tonight. I promised her that this evening would involve a massive, unforgettable transition of power that would permanently alter all of our lives forever. The main course arrived, thick cuts of prime beef. I sliced my meat with aggressive, steady precision. I chewed slowly, reveling in the dread radiating from the three traitors. I casually mentioned a dark fable about wolves hiding in the clothing of sheep, patiently waiting for the old shepherd to fall asleep. The absolute problem with greedy wolves is that they invariably turn on each other the very second the fresh meat runs out, I concluded. I looked directly at Cynthia, allowing a cold smile to touch my lips. The dense tension in the grand dining room finally became an unbearable physical weight, pressing down heavily upon their silently panicking, treacherous hearts. The heavy silence that followed my fable about the wolves hung over the grand dining room like a thick, suffocating fog. The absolute dread radiating from my three guests was a tangible force pulling the air directly from their lungs. I allowed that agonizing silence to stretch for a long, torturous minute, while the private chef silently cleared the main course and poured the final glasses of vintage Bordeaux. When the heavy mahogany doors clicked shut, leaving the four of us completely isolated in the magnificent room, I finally made my move. I reached out with a perfectly steady hand and picked up my crystal wine glass. I took my heavy silver dessert spoon and tapped it gently against the rim. The sharp, clear, ringing sound pierced the stifling tension like a gunshot. I placed the glass down and placed both of my hands flat on the polished table. Then I stood up. I did not struggle. I did not wheeze or groan or lean on the heavy wooden cane resting uselessly against the far wall. I rose to my full, imposing height, with the smooth, commanding strength of a man who had conquered the ruthless corporate world for 4 decades. The frail, dying old man they had been eagerly waiting to bury completely vanished in a single terrifying instant. Derek dropped his gaze to his lap, his shoulders hunching defensively as if anticipating a physical blow. Cynthia stared up at me, her beautiful face freezing into a rigid mask of absolute panic. Dr. Miles Preston merely blinked, his arrogant smirk melting into an expression of profound, unadulterated confusion. I looked down at the three of them, my expression completely devoid of any warmth or paternal affection. I began to speak, my voice resonating with a deep, booming authority that commanded absolute attention. I told them that an anniversary is traditionally a time for profound reflection. It is a moment to look back on the shared history, the mutual sacrifices, and the bedrock of trust that supposedly binds a family together. I let my cold gaze slowly drift from my trembling son to my petrified wife. I continued, stating that a retirement is also a time for transition. It is the specific moment when a patriarch steps aside and officially hands the keys of his hard-earned kingdom over to the next deserving generation. I paused, letting the heavy weight of my words settle firmly on their shoulders. Derek let out a small, pathetic whimper, his shaking hands gripping the edge of the mahogany table as if the floor were suddenly dropping away beneath him. I reached down to the empty chair beside me and picked up the thick manila folder I had deliberately hidden there before the dinner began. I held the heavy file up to the light of the crystal chandeliers, letting them clearly see the official federal seals stamped across the front cover. I stepped away from the head of the table. I walked slowly and deliberately around the edge, my footsteps echoing sharply against the polished marble floor. I stopped directly behind Dr. Miles Preston. The cardiologist stiffened his knuckles, turning white as he gripped his linen napkin. He tried to turn his head to look at me, but a sudden paralyzing fear kept his gaze locked completely forward. I raised the thick manila folder and dropped it with a loud, violent slap directly onto the center of his empty porcelain dessert plate. The heavy thud made all three of them physically jump in their seats. I leaned down, placing my hands on the high back of his chair, bringing my face right next to his sweating ear. "Dr. Preston," I whispered, my voice dripping with absolute freezing venom. "You are a brilliant cardiologist, but you are a completely terrible hitman." The doctor gasped, his entire body jerking violently as if he had just touched a live electrical wire. The last remnants of his arrogant, polished facade shattered into a million tiny, irreparable pieces. All the color instantly drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, terrifying shade of ashen gray. His chest began to heave with rapid, shallow breaths as his panic-stricken eyes darted frantically around the room. He slowly turned his head, looking past my imposing frame, and fixed a stare of absolute, unadulterated horror directly onto Cynthia. He was desperately seeking reassurance from the woman who had seduced him into this murderous conspiracy. He wanted her to tell him that this was just a terrible misunderstanding, a sick joke played by a paranoid old man. But Cynthia could not help him. She was staring at the thick folder on his plate, her blue eyes wide with a terrifying realization. She knew exactly what I had discovered. I stood up straight, commanding the room once again. I gestured toward the folder sitting in front of the trembling cardiologist. I loudly announced that the document contained the comprehensive results of an independent, highly classified toxicology screen conducted in Indiana just 3 weeks ago. I detailed how the report flawlessly isolated the synthetic, untraceable compound he had secretly formulated to artificially induce a fatal myocardial infarction. I watched the absolute terror consume him as I casually recited the exact chemical breakdown of the poison he had so arrogantly assumed would never be discovered. Miles Preston began to shake uncontrollably. He tried to speak, but his throat was completely dry. He stammered out a pathetic, broken denial, claiming that I was completely insane, that he had only ever prescribed standard, highly regulated heart medication to manage my deteriorating condition. I laughed, a harsh, unforgiving sound that offered no mercy. I told him that his pathetic lies were entirely useless now. I revealed that I possessed the high-definition audio recordings of the secret phone calls where his beloved Cynthia had coldly outlined the entire murder plot to her private attorney. I watched the devastating realization hit the doctor with the crushing force of a freight train. I slowly explained that Cynthia had never intended to run away to the French Riviera with him. I told him that she had deliberately kept his original handwritten prescription pads and the encrypted text messages detailing the poison. I announced to the entire table that her ultimate plan was to play the grieving, devastated widow, handing all of his incredibly damning evidence directly over to the district attorney the second my heart finally stopped beating. She was going to successfully sue him for gross medical malpractice and personally ensure he was convicted of first-degree manslaughter just to silence him forever. Miles Preston let out a choked, devastated sob. The sheer magnitude of Cynthia's profound sociopathic betrayal broke his spirit completely. He slumped forward in his chair, burying his sweating face in his shaking hands. The brilliant cardiologist who had arrogantly plotted to end my life was now nothing but a pathetic, sobbing mess. He fully realized his entire future was completely destroyed by the very woman he loved. The grand dinner party had officially become an absolute slaughter. The trap was perfectly sprung, and there was no escape. I smiled coldly, finally bringing justice to this treacherous room. Before Cynthia could even attempt to open her mouth to articulate a single frantic defense, I reached down and retrieved the second thick manila folder from the empty chair beside me. I walked around the edge of the polished mahogany table, my slow footsteps echoing like the heavy ticking of a lethal countdown clock. I stopped directly behind my sweating, trembling son. I slammed the heavy file down onto his porcelain plate, shattering the delicate crystal water glass resting right next to it. Derek flinched violently, covering his head with his shaking arms, as if he expected the heavy ceiling to physically collapse on top of his miserable, guilty shoulders. "And you, Derek," I said, my voice dropping to a low, terrifying rumble that vibrated intensely through the grand dining room. $4 million in underground cryptocurrency debt. You were actively embezzling massive amounts of capital from my firm through 12 completely fabricated offshore shell companies, just desperately trying to buy enough precious time while you waited for this pathetic cardiologist to finally stop my heart. Derek let out a pathetic, suffocated gasp. He stared blankly at the highly detailed financial ledgers spilling out across his dinner plate, exposing every single fraudulent wire transfer he had ever authorized. His face instantly turned a sickly, translucent shade of white. He looked up at me with tears streaming down his cheeks, opening his mouth to beg for a mercy he absolutely did not deserve. I immediately raised my hand, silencing his pathetic whimpers with a single commanding gesture. "Do not dare insult my intelligence by begging," I ordered coldly. "You sold your own father's life to quickly pay off violent street thugs. You thought you were incredibly clever, secretly aligning yourself with your manipulative stepmother to comfortably inherit my logistical empire. But you are nothing but a foolish, incredibly naive pawn in a much darker game." I turned my attention back to the head of the table, focusing my absolute burning fury entirely on my beautiful, treacherous wife. Cynthia was tightly gripping the edge of the long table, her knuckles stark white, her breathing becoming shallow and highly erratic. She knew the walls were rapidly closing in, but she had not yet realized the true absolute depth of her impending destruction. I reached into the inner pocket of my tailored charcoal jacket and pulled out a small, highly advanced digital audio remote. I pressed a single silver button. The sophisticated surround sound system I had custom installed in the dining room instantly crackled to life. Suddenly, Cynthia's own voice filled the large, quiet space, echoing off the cold marble walls with crystal clear, undeniable clarity. It was the exact secret recording from her private closet, seamlessly captured just 24 hours earlier. We all listened together in absolute agonizing silence as her recorded voice coldly discussed my failing heart, confidently bragging to her ruthless private attorney about the fake 50% asset split. Dr. Preston abruptly raised his head, his tear-filled eyes widening in total disbelief as he listened to the woman he loved call him a completely spineless idiot. The pristine audio recording continued to play loudly, actively, broadcasting Cynthia's vicious plan to meticulously secure the original handwritten prescription pads, and the highly encrypted text messages. Her recorded voice dripped with arrogant malice as she proudly detailed her brilliant strategy to hand the doctor directly over to the aggressive district attorney, fully intending to sue him for gross medical malpractice and frame him for first-degree manslaughter. A horrifying, strangled sound violently escaped the doctor's throat. He stared at Cynthia as if she had suddenly transformed into a terrifying, utterly unrecognizable demon sitting right in front of him. The digital recording marched forward seamlessly, shifting to her ultimate devastating plans for my pathetic son. Derek's jaw dropped wide open as he clearly heard his stepmother confidently brag about secretly hiring a private forensic accountant to silently track his hidden offshore shell companies. He listened to her joyful, highly triumphant laughter as she explicitly promised her mercenary lawyer that she would personally trigger a massive federal audit the very moment I was safely buried under the earth. "Let him rot in a federal cell," her recorded voice hissed through the hidden speakers, permanently destroying the fragile, deceitful alliance they had foolishly formed against me. The lengthy audio file finally ended with a sharp, heavy click, plunging the lavish dining room back into a thick, suffocating silence. I slowly walked back to the head of the long mahogany table standing over my completely paralyzed wife. "She was never going to run away to the French Riviera with you, Miles," I stated, my voice echoing with absolute authority. "She was going to perfectly frame you for my premeditated murder, specifically ensuring you spent the remainder of your natural life rotting inside a maximum security federal prison just to silence you forever. And you, Derek," I said, turning my piercing gaze to my hyperventilating son. "She had the federal fraud division on speed dial. She was fully prepared to permanently lock you in a federal cage the very day my lifeless body went into the ground. She orchestrated this entire massacre to easily walk away with 100% of my entire estate." The profound shock hanging in the brightly lit room rapidly mutated into a volatile, incredibly explosive rage. Dr. Preston lunged aggressively forward with his trembling hands violently grabbing the sharp edge of the heavy wooden table. He screamed at Cynthia, his voice cracking with hysterical devastation, cursing her for maliciously destroying his medical career and manipulating his deeply misplaced affection. Derek was actively weeping uncontrollably, his head buried deep inside his folded arms, rocking back and forth, as the terrifying reality of his massive federal crimes fully materialized inside his cowardly mind. Cynthia sat perfectly rigid, her beautiful face twisted into a grotesque mask of pure, unadulterated terror. She tried to stand up, perhaps to run toward the private elevator, but her trembling legs completely failed her, forcing her to heavily collapse back into her cushioned dining chair. I watched the three of them violently turn on each other exactly like starving, desperate wolves trapped permanently inside a tiny, inescapable metal cage. The brilliant, highly sophisticated facade of their deadly financial alliance had been completely pulverized, leaving absolutely nothing but ugly, naked betrayal in its chaotic wake. They had arrogantly believed they could easily outsmart a man who had spent 4 grueling decades successfully dominating the most ruthless corporate predators on the planet. They had completely underestimated the burning, relentless fury of a determined patriarch pushed far past the absolute limit of human forgiveness. I remained perfectly calm amidst the hysterical shouting and the pathetic sobbing. The ultimate crushing weight of federal justice was finally descending heavily upon them, and I fully intended to supervise every single second of their complete and total financial and absolute legal ruin. The heavy oak doors of the dining room suddenly swung open with a resounding crash. A dozen heavily armed federal agents poured into the space, their voices barking absolute commands. The magnificent stage play of their miserable lives had reached its inescapable curtain call. The federal agents moved with terrifying efficiency, flooding the grand dining room in a wave of gear and drawn weapons. Their authoritative voices commanded everyone to remain exactly where they were, but the sheer panic possessing my 3 treacherous guests instantly shattered any semblance of order. Dr. Miles Preston completely ignored the commands of the officers. The absolute realization that his medical career and personal freedom had just been permanently destroyed by the beautiful woman sitting across from him violently snapped his arrogant mind. He let out a raw scream that tore through the chaos. He violently propelled his body forward, launching himself completely across the mahogany table directly toward Cynthia. His flailing arms swept across the white tablecloth, catching the decanter and his glass of Bordeaux. The dark red wine exploded across the table, splashing violently across the china and soaking into the fabric like a pool of fresh blood. Dr. Preston completely ignored the mess, his hands wildly grasping for Cynthia's throat as he screamed a continuous stream of vile accusations. He cursed her for manipulating his lonely heart, for seducing him into a murderous conspiracy, and for attempting to single-handedly frame him for my calculated death. Cynthia shrieked in absolute terror, violently pushing her chair backward to escape his frantic, grasping hands. The wooden chair tipped backward, sending her crashing painfully onto the cold marble floor. Before the doctor could reach her, 2 federal agents intercepted his path, tackling him to the ground and pinning his arms forcefully behind his back. The sounds of the struggling, shouting cardiologist completely drowned out the delicate string music I had softly playing in the background. I remained perfectly still in my leather chair at the head of the table. I slowly reached out, picked up my untouched glass of wine, and took a deeply satisfying sip. I watched the violent spectacle unfolding in front of me with the detached analytical gaze of a man studying a fascinating experiment. The magnificent stage I had set was now functioning exactly as I had designed it. I turned my attention slightly to my left, where my cowardly son was actively experiencing the absolute collapse of his entire existence. Derek was not fighting the federal agents. He lacked the courage required for any physical confrontation. Instead, as a stern officer grabbed his shoulder and ordered him to stand up and place his hands behind his back, Derek completely collapsed. His knees buckled entirely, sending him crumpling into a pathetic, weeping heap on the polished marble floor. His tuxedo jacket bunched up around his shaking shoulders as he buried his face in his hands, releasing a series of loud, hysterical sobs. He completely ignored the agent reading him his rights, choosing instead to crawl pathetically on his hands and knees directly toward my chair. He reached out with a trembling hand, desperately gripping the pressed fabric of my charcoal trousers. He looked up at me with eyes wide with absolute suffocating terror. His face was stained with hot tears, and his breath came in rapid gasps. He begged me to stop the federal agents. He pleaded with me to use my massive wealth and corporate influence to make this entire nightmare simply disappear. He frantically promised that he would do absolutely anything I wanted, that he would work the lowest entry-level position in the logistics empire for the rest of his life. He screamed that his underground cryptocurrency creditors were going to physically murder him in federal prison if I did not instantly intervene and pay off his debt. I looked down at the pathetic, weeping creature gripping my leg. I felt absolutely no paternal warmth, no instinct to protect the boy I had joyfully raised. I simply saw a treacherous, greedy parasite who had actively planned to watch me choke to death on synthetic poison. I gently but firmly placed my leather shoe squarely against his chest and pushed him backward, breaking his desperate grip on my trousers. I told him in a quiet, completely merciless voice that he had personally forged his own federal chains, the very moment he decided my life was worth less than his gambling debts. 2 federal agents immediately stepped forward, grabbing Derek by his arms and hauling his limp body up from the marble floor. They quickly secured heavy steel handcuffs around his trembling wrists. Across the dining room, Cynthia had finally managed to scramble to her feet. The beautiful, elegant mask of the perfect hostess had completely melted away, leaving behind the ugly, desperate face of a trapped sociopath. Her emerald gown was torn at the hem and deeply stained with the spilled red wine. She completely ignored the federal agent attempting to read her rights. She turned her wild, panicked eyes directly toward me, her face contorting into an expression of pure hatred. She opened her mouth and unleashed a torrent of vicious, screaming curses that echoed sharply off the high penthouse ceiling. She called me a vindictive, paranoid old monster. She screamed that I absolutely deserved to die for treating her like a corporate accessory for 20 years. Her desperate shouting quickly shifted from angry insults to frantic, incredibly pathetic legal negotiations. She wildly turned her attention to the lead federal agent, desperately claiming that she possessed absolute, undeniable legal immunity. She frantically shrieked that she was working as a brave corporate whistleblower. She falsely claimed she had secretly gathered the evidence against Derek and Dr. Preston with the noble intention of handing it directly over to the authorities. She loudly insisted she was completely innocent of any actual conspiracy and was merely playing along to gather the necessary forensic proof. The lead federal agent, a tall, imposing man with a stern expression, simply stared at her with complete, unfiltered professional disgust. He calmly informed her that they had already spent the entire morning reviewing the high-definition audio recording captured inside her private closet. He explicitly noted that her secret, highly detailed conversation with her ruthless private attorney completely destroyed any possible claim of innocent whistleblowing. He smoothly recited her own recorded words back to her, reminding her that she had explicitly planned to wait for my heart to stop before framing the doctor and destroying my son. The absolute realization that her own brilliant sociopathic trap had been used perfectly against her finally silenced her frantic screaming. Cynthia stood completely frozen in the center of the ruined dining room, her mouth opening and closing silently, like a suffocating fish. The cold, heavy steel handcuffs clicked loudly around her delicate wrists, securing her permanently to the harsh, unforgiving reality of her own monumental greed. I remained comfortably seated at the head of the destroyed mahogany table, slowly swirling the dark vintage wine inside my crystal glass. The intoxicating aroma of the expensive Bordeaux mingled perfectly with the heavy, deeply satisfying scent of absolute justice. I took another slow, deliberate sip, letting the rich flavor wash over my tongue. I sat back in my heavy chair and peacefully watched the federal agents forcefully drag the three miserable, broken monsters out of my penthouse, completely clearing my life of their toxic, murderous presence forever. The heavy oak doors of the dining room suddenly swung open with a resounding crash. A dozen heavily armed federal agents poured into the space, their voices barking absolute commands. The magnificent stage play of their miserable lives had reached its inescapable curtain call. Leading the charge was Mitchell Crawford, my brilliant lead attorney, walking shoulder to shoulder with the district attorney. Mitchell adjusted his tailored suit jacket and offered me a brief, deeply respectful nod. The absolute chaos of the federal raid swept across the polished marble floor. The commanding shouts of the tactical officers echoed with deafening volume, instantly shattering the remaining tension. The brilliant trap I had painstakingly designed was finally snapping shut upon them completely now. I remained perfectly seated at the head of the long mahogany table, calmly swirling the dark vintage wine inside my crystal glass. Dr. Miles Preston threw his shaking hands directly into the air, his arrogant face completely devoid of any remaining color. He stumbled backward away from the imposing federal agents, desperately stammering out a frantic sequence of pathetic denials. He loudly claimed he was merely a dedicated medical professional attending a private anniversary dinner. A stern federal officer completely ignored his miserable lies, violently grabbing his velvet dinner jacket and forcefully slamming him chest first against the polished surface of the table. The sharp, clinking sound of heavy steel handcuffs quickly sealed his immediate and utterly devastating criminal fate. The district attorney stepped forward, holding a thick stack of official warrants tightly in his right hand. He looked down at the sobbing cardiologist with an expression of pure professional disgust. He explicitly informed Dr. Preston that he was being formally charged with conspiracy to commit first-degree murder alongside numerous severe violations of medical ethics. The doctor whimpered like a wounded animal, desperately pleading for a sudden leniency that he absolutely did not deserve. He foolishly tried to blame Cynthia for masterminding the entire deadly plot, aggressively screaming that she had manipulated his fragile emotions and forced his hand. The federal agents simply yanked him upright by his lapels, completely ignoring his pathetic, tearful cries, for absolute mercy today. Across the lavish dining room, Cynthia had violently backed herself into the far corner of the space. Her stunning emerald designer gown was now a wrinkled, completely ruined mess of expensive fabric. Her perfectly styled blonde hair fell across her panicked face in wild, unkempt strands. Two female federal agents approached her with their weapons securely holstered, but their expressions completely unyielding. Cynthia raised her hands defensively, frantically, shaking her head in sheer disbelief. She aggressively screamed that this was a massive misunderstanding, that she was the wealthy, respected wife of Victor Thorne, and that they had absolutely no legal right to touch her. The officers entirely ignored her arrogant shrieking, swiftly pinning her wrists behind her, shaking back immediately. The cold, heavy steel handcuffs clicked securely into place around Cynthia's delicate wrists, echoing sharply through the chaotic penthouse. She let out a piercing, hysterical shriek, thrashing her body aggressively against the firm grip of the trained federal officers. Mitchell Crawford stepped gracefully forward, holding a pristine legal document directly in front of her tearful eyes. He calmly informed her that she was facing federal charges for attempted murder, extensive wire fraud, and grand conspiracy. Cynthia spat a vicious curse directly at his face, her pristine facade completely replaced by the savage desperation of a cornered predator. She turned her furious, tear-stained face toward the head of the table, locking her blazing blue eyes directly onto my calm expression. She demanded that I stop this ridiculous madness immediately, desperately insisting that I still deeply loved her, despite her monumental mistakes. I placed my crystal wine glass down on the polished mahogany surface, my movements slow and incredibly deliberate. I looked directly into her panicking eyes and explicitly told her that the only thing I truly felt for her now was profound, unadulterated pity. I clearly explained that her immense greed had permanently blinded her to the absolute reality of her impending destruction. The district attorney signaled the two female officers, instructing them to forcefully remove the struggling prisoner from the luxurious premises. Cynthia kicked and screamed hysterically as they aggressively dragged her beautiful designer gown across the marble floor. The loud, frantic sound of her hysterical screaming rapidly faded as the federal agents forcefully maneuvered her into the private elevator waiting in the grand foyer. Dr. Miles Preston was the very next traitor to be physically removed from my magnificent home. The arrogant cardiologist was completely broken, crying uncontrollably as two large officers marched him roughly past my chair. He did not possess the remaining strength to even look at me. His entire world, built upon pure medical arrogance and poisonous deception, had been flawlessly dismantled in less than 20 minutes. The heavy elevator doors chimed and smoothly closed, taking the weeping doctor directly down to the waiting police cruisers, parked far outside the towering Chicago skyscraper, completely now. Mitchell Crawford calmly walked over to the head of the dining table, pulling a sleek leather chair out and taking a seat directly beside me. He placed his pristine leather briefcase upon the mahogany surface and offered a deeply satisfied smile. He quietly noted that the extensive federal operation had been executed with absolute, uncompromising perfection. The district attorney stood nearby, quietly observing the immense wreckage scattered across the luxurious penthouse. He politely nodded in my direction, acknowledging the highly classified cooperation I had seamlessly provided to his elite criminal division over the past 3 agonizing months. We had silently built an impenetrable, devastating legal case against the two murderous conspirators, trapping them perfectly inside their own immense criminal hubris. I took another smooth, incredibly satisfying sip of my vintage Bordeaux, letting the dark wine wash the lingering taste of betrayal from my tongue. I looked at Mitchell and firmly thanked him for his unwavering, absolute loyalty during this exceptionally difficult transition period. He respectfully bowed his head, officially stating that taking down such arrogant parasites was the absolute highlight of his long legal career. I turned my calm gaze back toward the sprawling, silent dining room. The heavy rain continued to furiously beat against the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, completely masking the chaotic police sirens wailing loudly, down on the dark, rain-slicked Chicago streets. The intense, suffocating tension that had previously poisoned the air was completely eradicated. The intense satisfaction blooming deeply inside my chest was completely intoxicating. I had flawlessly protected the massive logistics empire I spent 4 decades building. I had entirely outsmarted a brilliant, arrogant cardiologist and a beautiful, sociopathic wife who foolishly believed they could easily conquer me. The pathetic, dying old man they had eagerly planned to bury was absolutely nothing but a magnificent, incredibly deceptive illusion. I stood up from my leather chair, feeling stronger and more profoundly alive than I had in 20 years. I walked slowly over to the sprawling glass windows, gazing down at the glowing city lights shining brightly through the pouring rain. My dangerous, highly orchestrated trap had flawlessly concluded. The Grand Empire was finally secure. As the federal agents aggressively hauled my screaming wife and the sobbing cardiologist toward the heavy oak doors, I raised my right hand in a sharp, commanding gesture. The lead agent paused, looking back at me with a questioning gaze. I calmly pointed my finger directly at my son, who was currently curled into a pathetic, trembling ball on the polished marble floor. I instructed the federal authorities that they could take Dr. Preston and Cynthia away immediately, but they were to leave the boy with me. The lead agent nodded silently, fully understanding the complex parameters of the immunity deal my legal team had ruthlessly negotiated earlier that morning. An agent stepped forward, grabbed Derek by his shaking shoulders, and unlocked the heavy steel handcuffs with a loud metallic click. The heavy oak doors finally slammed shut, cutting off Cynthia's desperate, venomous shrieking, plunging the ruined dining room into a thick, suffocating silence. Only Derek remained. He stayed on his hands and knees, staring blankly at the dark red wine pooling across the expensive marble floor. He was hyperventilating, his thin chest heaving with rapid, shallow gasps. He slowly looked up at me, a tiny, pathetic glimmer of foolish hope sparking in his terrified, bloodshot eyes. He genuinely believed that because the federal agents had removed his restraints, his loving father had finally decided to spare him, to forgive his monumental, murderous betrayals, and to magically fix his catastrophic mistakes. "Stand up," I commanded, my voice entirely devoid of any residual paternal warmth. It was a cold, flat, heavily detached tone, the exact voice I utilized when dismantling a failing, useless corporate subsidiary. Derek struggled to obey. His legs were shaking so violently he had to grab the edge of the mahogany table to pull his miserable frame upward. He stood before me, his expensive tuxedo wrinkled and deeply stained, his face a portrait of absolute, unadulterated cowardice. He opened his mouth, preparing to offer another endless stream of pathetic, weeping apologies, but I immediately cut him off. "You are officially terminated from your position as the Chief Operating Officer of my logistics empire, effective immediately." I stated my words, falling upon him like heavy stones. "Your corporate security clearance has been completely revoked. Your digital access to the main servers, the offshore accounts, and the international ledgers has been permanently severed. You no longer possess any authority, any title, or any association with the company I spent 40 years bleeding to build." Derek swayed on his feet, his jaw dropping open. "Dad, please," he whimpered, a fresh wave of tears spilling down his pale, sweating cheeks. "You cannot just cut me off. The cryptocurrency debt is massive. Those men, they do not care about excuses. They will literally end my life if I do not transfer the capital by midnight tonight." "That is no longer my problem, Derek," I replied smoothly, leaning back in my leather chair and resting my hands on the armrests. I spent the entire afternoon working directly with my private forensic accountant and my personal banking team. We completely drained the 12 fake shell companies you so foolishly created. We successfully recovered every single penny of the $4 million you aggressively embezzled from my firm. But we did not stop there. I watched his bloodshot eyes widen in profound horror as the absolute reality of my meticulous counterattack finally began to sink into his dense, arrogant brain. "I also legally seized every single one of your personal financial assets," I continued, my voice echoing clearly in the quiet, ruined room. "I liquidated your private investment portfolios. I completely emptied your personal checking and savings accounts. I even instructed my legal team to aggressively target the equity in your luxury penthouse downtown to forcefully cover the substantial legal fees and internal auditing costs generated by your massive, deeply stupid corporate fraud. You took everything! Derek gasped, his voice cracking into a high, hysterical pitch. You left me with absolutely nothing, Dad. You are sentencing me to death. Those loan sharks are ruthless. They will find me. They will physically tear me apart. I am not sending you to federal prison, Derek, I said, leaning forward and locking my cold gaze directly onto his terrified, weeping face. Prison would provide you with 3 warm meals a day and a secure, heavily guarded cell. Prison would be a profound, undeserved mercy for a son who comfortably sat in my living room and happily discussed how long it would take for a synthetic poison to stop his own father's heart. Derek violently dropped to his knees, pressing his forehead against the cold marble floor, sobbing uncontrollably. He begged for my forgiveness, pleading for just one final financial bailout, promising that he would completely disappear and never bother me again. I felt absolutely nothing for him. The profound, crippling grief I had experienced when I first heard his treacherous voice on the hidden audio recording had completely evaporated, replaced entirely by the cold, hard clarity of absolute justice. You are going to walk out of that door right now with absolutely nothing, I declared, my voice resonating with an undeniable, terrifying finality. You have no job, no trust fund, no family inheritance, and absolutely no protection. You are entirely stripped of the powerful, wealthy name you so casually disgraced. And you should know, Derek, that your incredibly impatient, highly violent underground creditors are currently waiting for you in the lobby downstairs. My private security team politely informed them that you would be exiting the building very shortly. Derek let out a raw, guttural scream of absolute, unadulterated terror. He scrambled backward across the marble floor, completely desperate to avoid the heavy oak doors leading out of the penthouse. But his pathetic resistance was entirely useless. I raised my hand, signaling my private security guards, who had been standing silently in the shadows of the foyer. 2 large, imposing men dressed in sharp black suits stepped forward, their faces completely blank and utterly merciless. They grabbed my weeping, thrashing son by his arms, effortlessly lifting him off the floor. Derek kicked and screamed, crying out my name, begging me to save him from the terrifying, violent fate waiting for him in the brightly lit lobby below. I completely ignored his desperate, hysterical pleas. I sat perfectly still at the head of the ruined mahogany table, calmly swirling the dark vintage Bordeaux in my crystal glass. I watched as the heavy security doors firmly closed behind him, permanently sealing him outside of my world forever. The grand penthouse was finally enveloped in a deep, profound silence. The suffocating, toxic presence of my murderous wife, the arrogant, disgraced cardiologist, and my cowardly, treacherous son had been completely expunged. The storm outside the tall, heavy glass windows continued to rage, heavy rain violently lashing against the thick glass. But inside the dining room, the heavy, oppressive atmosphere had magically lifted. The grand stage was finally empty, the elaborate, deadly play concluded with absolute, uncompromising perfection. I slowly raised my crystal glass to the empty room, offering a quiet, satisfying toast to my survival and to the bright, peaceful future that lay ahead. The dust finally settled inside the sprawling penthouse, leaving behind a profound and absolute stillness. The magnificent mahogany dining table, once set for a treacherous celebration, now stood completely empty, bearing only the faint stains of spilled wine and shattered crystal. I walked slowly through the massive living space, savoring the crisp, quiet air that had previously been choked by lies and venomous ambition. I stepped through the heavy glass doors and walked out onto the expansive terrace. The fierce storm had finally broken, leaving the night sky incredibly clear and shockingly cold. I stood by the sleek metal railing, looking out over the glittering, sprawling skyline of downtown Chicago. The brilliant city lights stretched endlessly into the dark horizon, a beautiful testament to resilience and enduring strength. I stood there for hours, simply breathing in the chilly air, watching the countless headlights far below, moving like tiny insects through the beautiful, sprawling city. I breathed deeply, filling my lungs with the freezing night air. I was alone. I had no family left. The woman I had married was currently sitting inside a cold, concrete federal holding cell, stripped of her designer gowns and her sociopathic dreams of boundless wealth. The son I had raised and tried to prepare for greatness was currently wandering the unforgiving city streets, desperately looking over his shoulder, permanently exiled from the protective fortress of my vast empire. The brilliant cardiologist who had violated his sacred oath was facing the complete devastating annihilation of his medical career and his personal freedom. I had ruthlessly severed every single blood tie and every marital bond, casting them all out into the harsh wilderness they so richly deserved. Yet as I stood there observing the glowing city, I felt absolutely no regret. I possessed my health, my unyielding corporate empire, and my absolute undeniable freedom. The very next morning, I returned to my executive office with a renewed, relentless focus. I systematically restructured the entire executive board of my logistics company, promoting loyal, incredibly intelligent individuals who had actually earned their positions through decades of honest, grueling hard work. I completely eradicated the toxic corporate culture my son had attempted to foster, replacing it with a rigid, impenetrable system of absolute transparency and rigorous accountability. My business flourished, growing stronger and significantly more profitable than it had ever been during the past 2 decades. The pathetic, disorganized mess my son had secretly created was completely erased, smoothly, replaced by a highly efficient, remarkably lucrative operation that functioned with absolute uncompromising precision. I felt an incredible surge of pure energy coursing through my veins every morning, but I knew that securing my financial legacy was not entirely enough. I thought deeply about the failing heart that had initially made me so incredibly vulnerable to their vicious, calculating predation. I decided to utilize my immense wealth to create something genuinely meaningful and profoundly lasting. I legally established a massive, heavily endowed medical trust fund dedicated entirely to financing advanced cardiovascular research and providing free life-saving heart surgeries for underprivileged patients. I directed millions of dollars toward brilliant, dedicated doctors who actually valued human life, actively ensuring that men, women, and children who truly deserved to live would receive the exact medical miracles they desperately needed. The grand penthouse is quiet now, but it is a deeply comforting, incredibly peaceful silence. I no longer rely on a heavy wooden cane to walk, and I no longer sleep with one eye open, constantly waiting for the wolves to strike in the dark. I survived the absolute worst betrayal imaginable, completely burning down my own treacherous house to effectively purify the ground beneath it. The brilliant, magnificent empire stands taller and infinitely stronger than ever before, firmly guided by a man who finally learned to see the world exactly as it is. I am absolutely invincible, completely unstoppable, and entirely free from their poisonous grasp. Lesson blood does not guarantee loyalty, and a polite smile can hide the sharpest knife. In life, we often close our eyes to the red flags of those closest to us because the truth is too painful to accept. But ignoring reality doesn't protect you. It only empowers those who wish to exploit you. True strength lies in having the courage to see people exactly for who they are, not who you wish them to be. When betrayal comes from within your own house, you must be willing to burn the house down to survive the flames. Call to action. Have you ever trusted the wrong person only to find out they were plotting against you? Drop a comment below and share your story of survival. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button, give this video a like, and ring the bell for more intense life stories.